As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Tonight we have a distinguished returning guest, G Edward Griffin, author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Another look at the foundation of the Federal Reserve is here with us again on Reluctant Preppers. G Edward Griffin, thank you for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Well, thank you, Dunnigan. It's good to be here, and I appreciate the offer.
When we were trying to arrange this interview with you, your administrative assistant explained to us that we couldn't get on your calendar because you were busy preparing for a Global Warming Hoax conference on a recent weekend. And we have you back now following that conference and wonder if you could give us some of the key takeaways and main messages that were delivered at that conference.
Sure. It's a very exciting and interesting topic. First of all, I'd like to clarify that it wasn't really a global warming hoax conference. It was an anti-global warming hoax conference. And of course, I know that's understood, but I wanted to clarify the fact that we who were putting on the conference are very alarmed over the fact that, in our view at least, this whole issue of what they call anthropomorphic global warming, which means global warming caused by man, not by nature or the solar system or whatever, that this whole idea of man-made global warming is in fact a hoax. It's a gigantic hoax, and it's as we shall see as the program progresses, and when we look at the science of it, the people who are promoting it well know that the science is junk science. There's no question anymore. In the beginning, I thought, hey, we have to point this out to these people, why they've made terrible mistakes. We should help them understand, even though they were scientists. We were thinking, well, even scientists can make mistakes and all of that. But the deeper we got into it, Dunnigan, is we found that the so-called scientists, they were scientists for hire, had prostituted their profession and were deliberately and consciously distorting the data to produce a political result, not a scientific finding. And this was very alarming to all of us, and we decided that since the hoax, or the myth, if you want to be a little more gentle, the deception was so rampant. You read it in the newspaper all the time. And I see the latest headlines this week are Bill Gates and his very wealthy people are putting up billions of dollars to promote solutions, so-called solutions to global warming, And so naturally, when the average person reads that, he says, well, these people are very philanthropic. They care about the world. They care about the planet. They care about future generations, and they want to do things. So all of this is overwhelming, and it's not so much the delivery of the false science, because that's pretty hard to do, because it is false. And the minute you get into the science, you begin to question it. So they try and stay away from the science and just talk about the heartwarming parts of it. Like we've got to preserve the planet. We've got to put an end to pollution, and we care about children, and all of these heartwarming things. As long as they're talking about that, who's going to object? We all want those things, and so we are inundated with this kind of information flowing over us every day, and it's really hard to break free from that and objectively face the scientific facts. And when you do that, you come to the horrible realization that this is a hoax, and that we are victims of a hoax, and that the motive behind all of this, and I'm going to cut right to the chase now, we can come back to the science in a moment, but the motive behind all of this has to be understood, because unless we know why these coin-operated scientists are distorting fact, and why the politicians are presenting this myth to us, is because they have an agenda. And the simple way of saying it, is follow the money. Everybody knows that phrase, but they don't want to do it when the people speaking are talking about the future generation and saving the planet and so forth. It's hard to believe that these people who talk so nicely would actually be motivated by profit or political power. And when you follow that rabbit hole, you go down to the bottom of it, that is exactly what you discover, that it is money. It is political power that motivates this gigantic hoax. Now, that's a very controversial thing. People don't want to hear that. It's certainly contrary to, I was going to say popular wisdom. I'm going to back off of that because more and more people are questioning this whole idea. When I first started realizing this and speaking against it, I would guess that 90% or more of the population firmly believed that global warming was the scientific fact, and they were all emotionally involved in it, like I had been prior to that. We had to do something about this. But now, the latest polls are showing that about half of the people, at least in the United States, and I think more than that in Europe and other parts of the world, so in general, I guess half of the population of the planet now has come to the awareness that, hey, this isn't really science at all. There are political and monetary incentives behind this hoax. So progress is being made, but still, a lot has to be done because right now the leaders in this global warming myth or hoax, whatever you want to call it, are in the process of drafting laws, both at the national level and at the international level through the UN, which is going to make it illegal for people like us, or me in particular, to even question global warming. We're going to be classified as Holocaust deniers. Now they're going to call us global warming deniers, and that we are threatening the future of the planet, and we are criminals, and we should be put in prison. This is how far it's gone, and they're trying to get over that last stage as quickly as possible so they can silence this discussion, so they can silence the information that we have promoted in this conference. So time is running out, even though the population is waking up to the reality. If they are successful in criminalizing the questioning of this myth, well, then the game is over, and we've had it. So there's a kind of an urgency to this message, and that is what motivates us. Otherwise, we could sit back and say, oh, well, let them be wrong. Who cares? But we must care because they are passing laws and preparing to set into motion a political structure that is really totalitarian in nature. They're taking away our individual rights and our liberties, our right to property, our right to freedom of travel, now our right to freedom of expression. All of these things are being done in the name of stopping global warming, which doesn't even exist, or at least man-made global warming. So that's what's, in a nutshell, that's what the whole thing is about. I mentioned the junk science, which we could talk about, but the most important thing, I think, is to understand what motivates the myth makers in the first place. Once we understand that, then it becomes more plausible as to how they could be making such scientific errors, when in fact we realize that they're not errors at all, they're deception. And that's a horrible thing.
All of what you've said is fascinating, and I do want to get into it a step at a time. One of the things that really leapt out, and that was the idea of silencing discussion. I have a scientific background, a scientific degree and training. I've spent a good part of my career in scientific in pursuit. And one of the hallmarks of science that attracted me and continued to attract me throughout that was the idea of open inquiry, the idea of that, as Galileo said, the nature is an open book to all who would choose to read it, and the idea being that the truth is before us, and we are half blind, stumbling around trying to figure it out, but that in order to help each other along the way, we naturally would share information, share insight, test hypotheses. That openness and freedom of discussion, debate, theories, testing and exploring is absolutely essential to the very nature of true science. So that seems so antithetical to science itself, to say that in the name of science we're going to shut down discussion.
Yeah. Well, of course, historically, we know every time that the questioning of consensus science is what they like to call it. Every time in history that was done and people were burned at the stake for thinking that the earth was not flat and all of that kind of thing, why every time the law is used to protect one side of a scientific issue, you know that the side being protected by the law is wrong. It's false. Otherwise, it doesn't need legal force on its side. Open truth and debate never needs to be defended because it's its own defense.
And then furthermore, you talked about the actual junk science itself. I have to be curious, and maybe our viewers are as well. How did you get dragged into this? This isn't the first controversial situation that you've investigated. You seem to be a serial controversial issue investigator and exposer and writer. And maybe you can't help it because that's where your passion draws you. But could you please just give us a real brief understanding of how you got into this in the first place?
Yeah, I like your description. I am a serial controversial person. I guess. And also, you hit it right on the nail when you asked me how I got dragged into this. The word "dragged" was right. It was right on because I never intend to get into these things. I always think to myself, I got enough controversy as it is. I'm just going to stick with what I've studied and know about. And of course, my strong points, if you want to call them that, are the banking, the Federal Reserve System, and I know a little bit about cancer research and therapy and alternative medicine and so forth. I like to stick to the things that I've spent my life studying and learning, but every once in a while I rub up against something else, and as you say, I get dragged into it unintentionally. So anyway, how this all happened was some years ago. I had a film crew out to my house, and they were interviewing me on camera for it had something to do with the Federal Reserve, I think. And during the break when they were changing chips for their film, or after we had finished it, anyway, there was an off time, and I asked the producer of the crew, I said, what do you guys do? What are you up to? You have any interesting projects other than this? And they said, oh, yeah, that we're working on something to do with global, or not global warming, but chemtrails. Yeah, and they said, do you know about chemtrails? I said, well, not really, except I have some strong opinions. My opinion is that these things we're looking at in the sky are not the old-fashioned contrails, which are nothing but, condensation of ice crystals. So I've looked at contrails a lot, and they usually, they trail about maybe a half a mile or maybe a mile behind the jets as you see them flying, and they dissipate. The crystals are finally dissipated into the air, and so this little white plume just travels along after the airplane, and it's just a little short thing. But lately, I've noticed that these plumes go from horizon to horizon, and they stay there all day, and they spread out one upon the other, and by the time you hit 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky is milky instead of clear blue. I said, that's obviously there's something different. I said, that is what I think I know. Well, they said, would you like to say that on camera? And being a fool, I said, sure, I'll say that on camera, as long as everyone understands it's just my opinion. I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me that there's a difference here. So they did, and that's how I got dragged into it, because all of a sudden people were asking me questions as though I were an expert. How do you explain this and so forth? And I started to do some research, and then I made another huge mistake. I decided to help these fellas with funding for their video project. So now my name shows up on the film as a producer. And so now I'm a world expert on chemtrails, supposedly. And so I had to bone up on it because I was being asked questions. Well, that's kind of, what happened with global warming. I've expressed my opinion that I don't like the science that I see. I see it as junk science being offered in defense of this whole thing. And I've made statements on the radio, like maybe right now. And then I decided, hey, we got to get this word out. So I sponsored an event in Phoenix, not San Francisco, but in Phoenix, called Global Warming, An Inconvenient Lie, and had all the real experts there, the college professors and the scientists, the journalists. But since my name was attached to the sponsorship, I'm the expert, supposedly. So, yeah, I get dragged into these things, and am a serial victim, I suppose, of controversy, especially when I think that the public is being lied to, and when it makes a big difference to the future. I'm a sucker for those things.
Well, goodness gracious, among our viewers, your approval rating across years and across the many conversations that we've had together is exceedingly high. You've got a great number of people who deeply appreciate that you bring the facilities that you do to bear against these things that the common person is pretty much feels beyond themselves and pretty much helpless, other than to just accept whatever we're told. So could you lead us into a layman's explanation of what you see to be the main things that are wrong with the science around global warming?
Well, that's really easy. The main thing is, the main thing. How do you determine the main thing? There are so many deceptions. But one of the main things is that we have to distinguish between global warming and pollution. Those are two basically different topics. You could argue that pollution had some effect on global warming, but you'd be hard-pressed to prove it. Nobody likes pollution. We all hate pollution, and we want to do everything we can to eliminate pollution. And therefore, one of the things the deceivers do is to throw pollution into the same basket as global warming, and they speak of the two things as synonymous. And you're not supposed to notice that trick. Basically, if you notice and dissect their books and their essays and their public statements, it goes something like this. Well, since global warming and pollution is a real problem, therefore, wait a minute, let's separate out all the garbage from global warming. It doesn't cause global warming. So that's the first trick that you have to be aware of. We hate pollution. We must do something about it. It is a problem, but that is not a case for global warming. There's no science to demonstrate that whatsoever. The next thing is that they say, well, global warming it's happening and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Well, that is a half-truth. If I were marking somebody's paper on that in my class, I'd give them half credit. There was a period when this planet was warming in the last couple of decades, ever so slightly, a little bit, a tenth of 1 degree over 20 years or something like that, and just a little bit. And so projecting that into the future, the deceivers have said, look, if this goes on, and then they crafted a hockey stick graph, which we might come back to as pure fabrication of data. But even if you project it as a straight line without this hockey stick fabrication, why, you could say eventually the planet's going to be so hot we'll all burn up. Well, the fact of the matter is that if you look at the long chart going back thousands of years, and they do know the temperatures of thousands of years ago because it shows up in the geological record, it shows up in the fossil records. There are ways, I don't really understand it, but scientists all agree on both sides of this category. They all agree that there are ways of looking at the fossils and the sediments in the oceans and things like that, and they can pretty well tell what the temperatures were over thousands of years in the past. And when you look at the long picture, you find out that this little bit of global warming we've had in the last couple of decades is peanuts compared to the long record. We have had periods in our history many, many times, like 20, 30 times more warm than it is now, even warmer than they're projecting for the future to be the end of mankind. We've already had those temperatures on this earth, and life forms flourished under those conditions. And as a matter of fact, we know that even the Arctic areas of the planet were covered with green, lush growth because you find the fossils down there underneath the ice and the snow. And the planet flourished, and there were not enough factories in those days to produce CO2 to cause global warming. So the second argument that the planet is warming is bunk. It was warming, and now it's going, we believe, and the evidence is showing, it stopped warming for sure. There's no doubt about that. The last 18 years or 19 years, there's been no global warming. Even though they've tried to fudge the data, they still can't produce global warming. So they're saying, oh, well, it's just a temporary blip. It's gonna get warmer, though, folks. It's going to get warmer, but it's not, okay? But now it looks like we're going into a cooling phase, which the planet has done many times in history. It goes into warm and into cool, back into warm, back into cool. And now we come to the final thing is the cause of this. They're saying it's CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They're saying that, look, over the history, you see every time that the temperature goes up, CO2 goes up too. And Al Gore had this big chart on the wall showing, sure enough, there's a correlation. You can see it. Temperature goes up, CO2 goes up. Temperature goes down, CO2 goes down. Perfect correlation. End of discussion, right? Wrong. Because if you really zero in on that chart, you see that the temperature went up before the CO2 went up. And the temperature went down before the CO2 went down. Yeah, they're correlated, but it turns out that the temperature is causing the CO2 change, not the CO2 causing the temperature change. So that is another one of those falsehoods, you see. And you go on and on and on, and everywhere you look, you see deliberate falsification of the data, and you cannot tell me that these scientists don't know exactly what they're doing. Well, we could go on, but that gives you an idea of everywhere you look. The melting of the polar caps, for example. Yeah, they melt and then they expand again historically. And right now, they're growing. Now, yeah, it's sure the Arctic may be losing some ice along one of the edges of the ice field, and so they go in and take pictures of that part of the continent, or the ice flows rather. Oh my golly, look at these glaciers! They're falling into the ocean, and they take dramatic pictures of them and say, oh yeah, the ice is melting, the oceans are rising, and then what they don't do is show you what's happening in the Antarctic. In the Antarctic, the ice is growing. Or in other parts of the Arctic, the ice is growing. They just show you that little tiny portion where the ice is shrinking and melting, and they plaster that all over the newspapers. Now you can't tell me these scientists don't know exactly what they're doing. They're cherry picking the data to convey this urgency in the minds of the readers and this feeling of panic. Oh, we must do something to stop global warming. And they talk about the polar bears are going to be extinct. Now, that's the poster child of global warming mantra. Look at these poor polar bears, and you look at them, they look kind of sickly and dirty, and they're clinging onto a little piece of floating ice. It's all bunk, because the polar bear population is growing, I say, really growing. They're beginning to wonder what to do with all these polar bears up there in the Arctic circles. So everywhere you look, as they say, you find false information, and it's time we think that the public knows it.
This you remind me when you talked about the false urgency that's being touted is the old quote of never let a crisis go to waste. But here it sounds like there's a manufactured crisis. So,
yes,
but again, not letting a crisis go to waste implies that there is some ulterior objective than just actually solving a problem. So could we turn your attention to, you mentioned in the beginning, there's a darker side to this, what seems altruistic on the surface of let's do what's right by Mother Earth, that sort of thing, but Mother Nature. But if that's not, in fact, what's driving this crisis promotion, then can you turn to what are the real verifiable and demonstratable progressions? If you just, as you say, watch the money and watch the power, how does this play out? How does adopting a public mindset and perception of accepting the myth of global warming, how does that play out in terms of money shift and power shift?
Well, it's the famous ploy of using fear to generate public acceptance of certain governmental policies that otherwise would be rejected. When people feel secure and they're happy with their existence, they are very jealous of their freedoms and their liberties and their privacy. But if you can convince them that their very survival is threatened by planetary environmental destruction or terrorism or crime or drugs or pornography or whatever a great threat can be presented to frighten people into questioning their security, then they're willing to give up their freedoms and their security, in other political security, I should say, and their privacy and whatever else, just to be protected in their mind against this terrible threat. Now, it's as simple as that. Machiavelli wrote about that years ago in his book, The Prince. He was giving advice to the prince. He said, look, if you want people to be content with your harsh rule, get involved in a war. You know, as long as they're worried about an enemy in a war, an enemy possibly coming in and taking over and killing them or putting them into slavery, they will accept any insult that you want to give to them because you are their leader and you are now defending them against this terrible threat. Now, Machiavelli wrote about that, and I'm sure it was well known before Machiavelli wrote about it, too. It's just one of the things that political leaders know and they can observe. And so that's basically the game, is to frighten everybody so that their freedoms and their financial security, their privacy, none of these things make any difference, because otherwise we're all going to die, or we're all going to, the planet's going to be destroyed, and they frighten us to death. Some people have called that fear porn, and I think it's a good name for it. Look what's happening. All of the proponents of this global warming hoax, you'll find that they either are politicians or they work for institutions that are funded by governments. Almost without exception. I can't think of any exception. There probably are, but certainly the overwhelming majority of the information about this global warming hoax is coming from people with a political agenda. Now, that political agenda is power and money. And we hear a lot about the carbon tax, right? Well, think about that. The carbon tax. They're even preparing to replace our monetary system with a carbon-based currency, so that it's bad enough to have pieces of paper that aren't worth anything, but just think of digits in a computer that are backed by your carbon footprint. So the amount of money you have to spend depends on how much you follow the rules and don't use up electricity, or don't travel, which would burn gasoline, or don't do anything which would take energy, because you want to be a good citizen of the world, you see. And so the more you comply with the rules that the politicians hand down, why, the better off you'll be. But meanwhile, everybody is crushed with the carbon tax so that the politicians can continue to enjoy their lives very well. Thank you. That's really what it's all about. It's money and power, and it's all being sold to the people of the world as necessary. Yes, very uncomfortable, very undesirable, but necessary in order to save the planet. That, in a nutshell, is the game that they're playing.
We've often had a precious metals and financial markets analyst by the name of Rob Kirby on our show, talking about the epic battle between globalists and sovereign states, and talking about the principle of subsidiarity, where natural law would dictate that decisions should rightly be made in order to give people the most autonomy, the most freedom at the lowest level, most local level, so that people can control their own destiny, control their own lives. And how that's the opposite of that if you look in, say, communist bloc countries and that sort of thing. We have command economies and people being, basically groomed up into what career they should take from when the day they're born, and having no choice in the matter, that sort of thing. So what does global warming have to do with globalism versus the sovereignty and the freedom of free people?
Well, the global warming issue is the motivator of all of that. It is the thing, the scare, the terror, you might say, in the minds of people that conditions them to meekly accept any solution that is offered by their political leaders. Now, what is the solution? It all emulates from the United Nations. It goes back quite a while now. There was a series of conferences. I won't go into all of that, but anyone who's interested in it will find the whole history in our video series that we're soon going to release, which is basically a record of what transpired at this conference in Phoenix. But it goes back to what they call a Rio conference, and then there were other conferences all sponsored by the UN, at which they formulated a plan to completely collectivize the world. It was the formula. It was a blueprint, and they called it Agenda 21. Agenda 21 meant this is what the United Nations wanted to see all of the countries of the world adopt in the 21st century. Now, they called the Agenda 21 as being motivated by environmentalism. In other words, to fight global warming and pollution and all that sort of thing. But when you looked at the essence of it, you saw that it was nothing but, as you mentioned a moment ago, communism. It was the same thing as was advocated in the Soviet Union and in Red China. And now here in the United States, we don't realize, many people don't, that what we are now building in the United States is exactly the same system that we fought a war against against the Nazis. And it's the same system that they had in the Soviet Union and in Red China. They just don't call it that. It's collectivism. That's the generic name for it, and the name that we like to use. So in order to fight global warming, we're told, in this Agenda 21 program, is that we have to regulate all human activity. Now, that's their phrase. They say all human activity. But don't forget, the myth tells us that the global warming that doesn't exist is caused by human activity. Humans are the enemy. Human production, human activity. These are the things that must be controlled in order to preserve the planet. So, therefore, the governments of the world are the elements, the institutions that will control all human activity. Well, that's communism, that's socialism, that's Nazism, that's whatever you want to call it. It's collectivism. So using global warming as the foundation piece, they build this structure on top of it. Now we have Agenda 21, which is the plan to implement the control of all human activity in all parts of the world. And believe it or not, in the United States, Agenda 21 has been officially adopted in almost every county. In fact, I'm going to say every county in America, and in most municipal areas as well, without calling it that. You analyze, and in some cases they do call it that, by the way, but not necessarily. But if you analyze the structure of what they're doing, it's all exactly from the blueprint put out by the United Nations called Agenda 21. Now they've had a later version on it. It's called Agenda 2030. Or the 2030 Agenda. It's just the next step, and it's just more of the same. It's heading to the final destination of what they hope will be a new world order, is the phrase they like to call it. They invented that phrase, not us. The new world order, which is world government based on the model of collectivism. And world government isn't necessarily bad if it was based on the principles of freedom and individual protections. But no, this world government is based on the principles of collectivism, which means all power at the top and that the people at the bottom must serve the state. All of this is really horrible to contemplate. It's something out of 1984. You think you're talking about a novel, but no, this is reality. These are today's headlines. If we understand what's behind them, we are moving rapidly into a 1984 type of environment in which all human activity is thoroughly regulated by the state, and the justification for doing that is to put an end to global warming, which doesn't even exist.
And that leads us back to how do you keep such a big lie under wraps? I mean, there are, I assume, legitimate scientists in the world who I would hope would be in the majority. We've certainly in the mainstream media, in the recent political campaign and so on, how it can be that the majority of the mainstream media outlets can all assume a certain position and all be telling the same narrative, and that narrative echoing that's being told by the administration and so on. So it can seem that as you go, you've got education, you've got media, you've got an entertainment, you've got government, and they're all saying the same thing, therefore it must be true. But at a very small percentage. This is a very small piece of the pie, a very concentrated communication power elite. So, do you believe it's the case that the majority of scientists actually know the truth, or are they all most being hoodwinked by the education, the training, and everything else that they're being told?
Well, my experience on that is, of course, not conclusive, but I've had a lot of exposure to scientists across the board on this issue. And my impression is that most scientists by far are aware that this is not good science. But the ones that work for government-funded institutions, even though they know it, are afraid to speak up because they know they'll lose their jobs. In fact, I won't mention the name, but one of the presenters at our conference, as a matter of fact, one of the strongest voices against this junk science, tells us that he is under tremendous pressure by the institution for which he works to shut up on this because they're afraid of losing federal funding. And if he doesn't close down his criticism of the global warming hoax, he thinks he's going to get fired. So, yeah, even the ones that are in the monster, so to speak, part of the in the belly of the beast, are having trouble because they're being told to keep quiet. And when they do speak up, they get kicked out, and then the media says, "Oh, this guy is a quack," and he got kicked out because of I don't know. They make up something, make him sound like he's a bad guy. And but to your question, outside of the sphere of government, scientists universally know that this is a hoax, and they speak constantly about this consensus. 97% of all scientists agree that global warming is real, and so forth. Well, that is the biggest lie of all. When you take a look at the actual statistics, even the ones that they publish, you find that it's less than 1% agree. Isn't that an incredible statement? But you'll see when you notice the charts and the background data that are being presented at our conference, when you actually challenge it, it breaks down to less than 1%. And they say 97%, and it's quoted all over the news. Every time you turn around, 97% of the scientists agree. That's not true. But people hear it. And so the answer to your question is, how does this happen? And Adolf Hitler provided the answer. He said in his book, Mein Kampf, he said, if you tell a lie that's big enough and often enough, and that's all that people hear, they will believe it. So there you have it. There's the answer. Of course, people are only hearing the lie, but hopefully with our conference being put on video and broadcast on the internet and distributed far and wide, they will hear something else for a change. They'll hear the truth.
Well, you mentioned the oppression that comes down on people who do want to speak out. And as I type the notes that I'm taking during this interview, I am absolutely convinced I will not be able to publish these notes on our YouTube channel when we post the video, because for videos where we've mentioned any of the topics that you've touched on here, we get what they call it does not meet the guidelines for non-advertiser friendly. We get funding withdrawn, and which is as good as no margin, no mission. We can't progress in that mode. That's why we've had to start our own private newsletter that people can subscribe to. If they go to reluctantpreppers.com, they can sign up for a free newsletter, and we can give you the full notes and all the supporting links and documents in the newsletter that you can sign up for free, that we can't put out there. So you mentioned this government. You mentioned a government researcher or a government-funded researcher who's under pressure to shut up, and here I'm just an independent journalist, and I'm under pressure to not put out things that don't match the accepted narrative as well.
Yeah. Well, that's what's happening in our world, and it's very unpleasant. It does not bode well for our future if we don't do something about it. The time is over for us to be armchair patriots and sit back and just read the news and try and be informed. It's time for us to get off of our chairs, off of our couches, and out into the public and start banging on on dishpans or something, making some noise and getting the truth out there. It's now or never.
So that leads us to the final question, and that is, what do you think are the most effective actions that people can take to really contribute to getting the truth out there and exposing the falsehoods here? Because it sounds like if we don't, we are in the jaws of the trap are ready to close, and with no notice, we could find our individual freedoms and sovereignty, just completely taken away with no recourse.
That's absolutely true. We're a lot closer than most people realize, and we're closer than I even want to think, but it could happen very quickly. So what do we do about it? There's an old saying that, truth is power, or knowledge is power. And again, I would give half credit for that one. Knowledge by itself is not power. Some of the most knowledgeable people have been put up against a wall and shot by the firing squad, not because they didn't have knowledge, but precisely because they did have knowledge, and that their enemies didn't want such people to exist. So knowledge by itself is not power, but when people act upon that knowledge intelligently and are willing to make some sacrifice of their time and their effort and their talent, now we can build a movement that can really change the world. And so the answer to that question is we have to get united. We have to assemble all of the people who really want to make a difference in the world, and not just watch history go by, but want to become part of making history. We have to get unified, and that's the reason we have our organization, which is Freedom Force International. So I'm not going to talk much about that, but those who want to really become part of a movement and make things change, please come to our website. It's freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org, and read all about it, as they used to say. And because we have the plan, I know we do, it's already beginning to work. All we need now is more people involved in the effort. It can be done.
Well, G Edward Griffin, you never cease to amaze us with the breadth of knowledge and depth of purpose that you stir us to. So, thank you extremely, for joining us here, for opening this discussion with us. I think we left several smoking or chemtrail guns along the way that we're going to need to get circled back and get more details on. But thank you very much for addressing this topic of the global warming hoax and giving people a clue of where they can find out more and actually take up a stand for liberty, for freedom, and for the truth. Thank you so much for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
All right. Thanks for inviting me.